I'm really delighted to have 3 MEPs with us for our next panel. And as I said, our role is about being a bridge between industry and policymakers. So a range of different views from the different political parties. We also have Sheila Warren, the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, who will moderate this panel. So thank you very much to you all. We're really looking forward to hearing your comments. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark, for that introduction. I think the goal here was to hear from a variety of perspectives in the wake of the election and to hear from folks on the Econ Committee who are going to be basically driving the agenda for the next 5 years in terms of what is taken up by this particular version of the European Parliament. And so I'll do a quick round of introductions and keep this very brief, but certainly feel free, panelists, to add a little color as I come to you with the first question. We have Nikos Papandreou, elected in this cycle from Greece, but I must note, a native Californian like myself, so always fun to see. Ondřej Kovařík, no stranger, I think, to most in this room. Czechia has been on Econ since his very first day in Brussels, another member of the class of 2019, and of course one of the most active MEPs that's been on Econ through the course of this last term with the files on payments and shadow on MiCA, etc. So again, no stranger to the room. And last but not least, we have Nikola Bartulica, who is a new Croatian MEP. So again, congratulations, have been elected in of course, this past June. Full member of Econ. He'll also be getting up to speed very quickly, has already been doing that on digital assets policy and where things are. So actually, maybe I'll start with Nikos, just as a newcomer to Econ, but somebody who certainly understands how the Parliament works, or doesn't, depending on the day, I suppose, and depending on the file. Are there specific areas of policy which you and the group of your colleagues have already identified as being particularly important, as having prioritization? And if so, are digital assets among that group of issues? Where do they fall in the priority list that you perceive so far?
Thank you, Sheila. I didn't expect that question. But before I say that, I think I really enjoyed the previous panel because there was excitement in it. And speaking of the grandmother that Alex spoke of, my task, among other things, is to understand the complexity, but then take it to the Greek grandmother. And the Greek grandmother, like all of us, can use the computer. She doesn't know how it works. So these things are very sophisticated right now. But some of it will come down for use cases. So if you use that word use case, it's how does it improve the life of the daily citizen? That's my task as a deputy. I won't answer that question. We have many reasons on that. As you say, for our group, S&D, is that what you mean, our Socialist Democrat?
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm a little bit of an exception because my past also included being in politics and being very close to business world. I was a consultant for many years. So I understand the complaints about the EU from the other side. And it's my task within the S&D to get them on board for the new things that we're doing. And of course they are, but the S&D generally is focused on the political, the social values, and the environment. And we have, of course, had one of our members was part of the digital currency last time, Euro from Finland. And from what I understand, and this is a learning process for me, MiCA is one of the good regulations. Maybe you were involved, and Mr. Berger was involved, and the Commission and the team did good work. And we see that it provided a space for something that was unregulated. In some sense, it provided a space for these new technologies to develop. Mm-hmm. So if we missed Web 1 and Web 2, which if we read the Draghi report, we missed, maybe we're on board for Web 3 on this one.
Well, Ondřej, I'm going to turn to you then, because I feel like that opened the door to get your perspective. You have a longer institutional perspective as well, but just thinking about what all has been accomplished, which is tremendous, of course, but where we stand today in this particular moment. The technology, of course, has advanced in parallel with MiCA moving through the various processes and now being an implementation. So I'm curious, for this next phase of things, what are you seeing as what's been achieved, what remains perhaps, what's the remainder that you see needs focus and attention?
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invite. I think now, after what I think exactly as you described was quite a workload in the past mandate.
Understatement.
Yeah, well, to put it diplomatically. I think now we are really in the stage of implementation and I think gradual application of all the new rules. We should not forget that, for instance, with the adoption of MiCA, which is a level 1 regulation, and others in financial services area and digital financial services area, the work usually doesn't stop there. It's usually just the beginning. We are currently under a number of consultations that are led by ESMA and EBA and European Commission on a number of individual respective, very detailed parts of MiCA, and I think this is also something that would require a lot of time and energy to put this in the right direction. And I think I would see this as the priority. I don't think we need to rush immediately into next round of regulatory frameworks. I think we really need to see first this one settling properly, also the industry adapting to it, and then as the years will follow, and also with the MiCA and other pieces of legislation, we have review clauses, and you know, we have deadlines where we should sit together and evaluate whether the purpose of the regulation was met or not. Mm-hmm. And these are, I think, would be great moments to also to come back to, you know, some specific points, whether they were properly addressed or not. But at the same time, I think even as you rightly pointed out, the market and the technology doesn't stop. It's actually evolving even faster. So I think we already see now some of the experience being gathered by the industry on potential weak points of the regulation, in stable coins, for instance, the distribution network. There's a number of issues actually that appear that may be problematic in practice, and I think it's already good to gather evidence in order to provide to the authorities enough food for thought, and then, you know, enough elements for future consideration. And I think last point that I would like to mention, we saw a lot of positive momentum with the adoption of MiCA. Compared Europe and the US, and a lot of businesses actually, you know, focusing on the European Union as a possible legislation, as a possible area with new legislation that may help the sector to grow. But I think we may end up at the beginning of next year and the first half of 2025 with a Trump administration in a different, let's say, well, in different dynamics, where many things can happen also on the US side, and this can actually have an impact on things developing in Europe. So I think this is also something that we should not lose from our side.
Mm-hmm. And so then to round out, I think, this first question, Stephen, as somebody who's newly elected, you know, and is thinking about this, I think, with a very fresh perspective, I imagine, I'm curious to understand both, feel free to answer this from a Croatian perspective or just as someone who's new to econ. Our digital assets, our crypto, our Web3 technology is an important issue, do you think? And given that this is a committee with a broad mandate, there's a lot of different files and other topics that certainly fall within the purview. Where do you see this particular topic falling in the priorities?
Thank you. I want to also thank Mark and your team for the kind invitation. I am still getting my feet wet, so to speak. I'm a newly elected member from Croatia serving in the ECR group. My first impressions are that this is certainly on the radar, although when I read requests for meetings from industry people, stakeholders, my sense is that at times it's not so easy for them to find people on the European Parliament side to speak with. You know, I was very open and made time to meet with people from FinTech and from your association as well. And I think my main message is that Europe needs to stay ahead of the curve because, as Ondřej mentioned, I think in the United States there will be a fast movement towards not just innovation, but deregulation. I think if the new administration succeeds in streamlining the federal bureaucracy, Europe, if it doesn't wake up, could become, in the next several years, irrelevant if we don't maintain the momentum. And so innovation is a popular word in Brussels. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't apply the principle of being pro-innovation to crypto. I see many advantages in this day and age where central banks like to print money. People are looking for a safe place to preserve value. It's obviously a good bet against inflation, Bitcoin, for example. So there's many advantages that are clear. And in Croatia, it's a relatively small country, but these digital assets are increasingly popular. My main concern, actually, as a parent, is to keep my younger children from becoming addicted to their phones, because it's so convenient, and I don't see really a future without it. The point I'm making is that we need to obviously keep in mind that this new digital generation has to use this technology prudently and not become addicted, because there's many things on the phone that I don't want my children to see. So that's the broader framework. But when it comes to what we're talking about today, I would generally say that the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. I will certainly be very active on several files in the committee. I'm just still learning how it works. It's very bureaucratic. But me and my staff, I think will do our best to really... I'm on the fisheries committee as well, which is much smaller. So I see that econ really, the workload is quite substantial. But for my part, I'm here at your disposal, and I'm also learning as we go along. The blockchain technology, I know it requires a lot of electricity, and there's a lot of concern from people who are worried about the energy side. But other than that, I really see this as something clean and something safe, and that something people want. Frankly, we live in an age where there's more and more control and supervision of people's day-to-day habits, and people want to maintain their privacy and freedom, and I think we need to help them in that.
There's so much there to unpack, and so I'm going to throw the script out and just kind of ask a couple of questions here, so some follow-ups. The first thing I'll just land as a point is that the Bitcoin blockchain certainly is energy intensive, but at this point every other layer 1 blockchain is actually quite not. And we have seen adjustments in the ecosystem around that, most specifically with something called the merge, which moved the Ethereum blockchain to being actually relatively quite low intensity. And this is the opportunity, of course, that we have at CCI, is to come in and bring this knowledge to a new generation of MEPs who in some cases are starting from different places. That being said, one of the beauties I think of econ is that you do have a group of people here, to your point, I'm seeing a lot of nodding from your colleagues, that is a very labor-intensive committee, so congratulations. But there's so many things, I think, that need doing there, and such a variety of understanding of the details of this. But I wanted to also mention just quickly something you mentioned. We've heard this morning, and we deliberately wanted to fashion this conversation throughout the entire day around the intersections of AI technologies and blockchain technology. And you heard from Ilya, you heard from others who flagged that is an issue of some concern. Certainly intersects with IDAS, like thinking about IDAS and all those kinds of identity questions are going to be highly relevant to the committee. And of course, AI, differently has energy components to it. It has trust and safety components to it. It has what is true and what is false, components to it, authentication components to it. And so all of that, we think, is underpinned by blockchain technology as of critical importance, which seems, I think, orthogonal or maybe adjacent to the work of econ, but they're all very, very related. So I'm curious, my question then to any of you, is how you are thinking about other technologies, how you are thinking about kind of social policies around this, whether it's something like trust and safety, whether it's hardware, whether it's thinking about the fact that subsequent generations are not just digitally native, which is, I think, obvious to your point about your children, but are also what I call crypto native, where the expectation of things like portability of data or transparency, right, or certain forms of security is heightened in ways it wasn't for even my generation. So I'm curious how these principles that haven't necessarily been embedded in MiCA, of course MiCA was, the origin story of that is so long ago, how you're thinking about moving from principles-based thinking to rules-based thinking given the new context and what is possible. And I'll throw that to any of you to answer first, but maybe I'll look to Ondřej because I think with the most history here.
Let him take the hard one.
Yeah, or very difficult question. I think, well, there's a number of possible economic, social, other impacts that the technology will have. But, well, I think if you ask me as a member of the European Parliament how do I look at technology, I would just throw the question back at you and say the technology, that's the matter of industry. I mean, this is where the real innovation happens.
Yeah.
And then where I see our role in that, and I hope that in several pieces of legislation we manage to strike that right balance, is actually create an environment where the innovation can happen, while at the same time respecting some of the key principles that we cherish and value in the European Union. Consumer protection, for instance, investors protection, some of the environmental aspects, the privacy and security. So there's, I think, a number of issues that are always somehow translated into pieces of legislation, where obviously I think all people involved in crypto as the financial services providers, they are pretty much aware that this is not only MiCA that is relevant for them.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of cybersecurity issues in DORA and NIS2 in the Cybersecurity Act. There's a lot of issues linked to the general horizontal data legislation. But I think where I see some of the potential problems in the future is actually where the crypto legislation or crypto regulatory framework intersects with the AI. And I think specifically one of the I think the earliest deadlines that we have ahead of us, we expect some findings from the European Commission on a DeFi ecosystem in general, because this was something that was not covered by MiCA, but we sort of find a solution to task the Commission and analyze the situation there. And I think if we look at, for instance, the evolution of smart contracts that are powered by AI, I think we are far more than the DeFi that we had on mind when we tasked the Commission. Yeah. And we didn't have the AI Act at that point in place, which will again kick in 2 years. And I think this will be also one of the questions how we exactly look at this area. If, let's say, if we take a decision on a political level that we will not classify DeFi projects as part of MiCA, but they will still fall under the regulation and the scope of regulation because of the AI Act mandate, then we may actually have some problems in future. And I think this is exactly the type of question we should look ahead and also discuss together as an industry and regulator. I mean, you see, as an industry, you see far more in the future than we do. But at the same time, I think with the new regulatory framework in place, which is quite robust, we should be able to identify and expect in the future things to come and already try to find now the solutions before some crises happen.
Nikos.
Yeah, before we finish also I wanted to say something I forgot earlier, but it's a very difficult one. I think from my understanding we have different competencies on the Digital Markets Act and all that, and we need to let that breathe. I think we've lost the chat game, the AI, because we're regulating it before it even appeared on the European scene. So we're having the foreign players, US mainly, and China has it, but we're not allowing it. So that one we need to figure out, at least me as a deputy, all of us, all of the different rules, the different laws that we passed on these issues. And I think we've strangled a little bit the AI, so we need to let it breathe. So that would be something, as you say, that we need to hear from you. Where are the problems? Where can we do the corrections? Not to add something on top of what we already have. I think we have enough from my understanding of the regulations on this. So AI will be part of it, but the way that AI is growing around the world, that's part of the Web3, and we seem to be a little bit behind the curve again on that. And Draghi points it out. We need, on all these things, education. We need to train in the universities to get on board with crypto and blockchain and make it part of the European future.
Stephen?
Well, regarding AI, I would say, I would mention just anecdotally, I had last week a interesting talk with someone from a very big tech company, and the concern was GDPR and how it's basically not allowing big corporations to develop AI products inside of Europe. So they feel too constrained. And I would just simply say the principle of personal responsibility. So people should be able to own really their information, but also be allowed to choose whether they're willing to share that something that's already maybe public, but is not able to be used by these big tech companies. And the danger is if we don't find the balance, they're going to continue developing these products elsewhere outside of Europe. So we have to pay attention to this. Yes, privacy is important, of course, and we're always vigilant about potential abuses, and that's something that I'm worried about with AI. It can be used for lots of good things, but it can be also misused. So, striking the right balance is critical, and thinking, like I said, and trying to be ahead of the curve. Because my sense is that if we don't address this properly, Europe may remain behind.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point, one comment. With all this regulation happening, and I think it will only be reinforced by whatever action is taken on the US side next year, we will see more and more, and I think it will just accelerate the mainstreaming of the crypto industry into financial services world. More and more. If you look at the MiCA, and if you look at the parts on stablecoins, like electronic money tokens, this is basically fit for banks to issue stablecoins, for traditional banks. Not the neo-banks. Or for traditional banks with a banking license, they have everything they need in MiCA to actually issue stablecoins. So I think this is also one of the trends that we will have to see possibly react on the more and more overlapping and mainstreaming of the crypto sector, the digital asset sector, towards the traditional financial services world. I don't know who will be more willing to get closer to each other. I think this is something that we will see in practice happening, but it will definitely be the case, and we would have to somehow react. Even, for instance, by and I said that I would rather make a regulatory pause and see things being implemented, but there may be one exception. Is actually look into the existing financial legislation that is already in place for other financial services than crypto, for in MiFID and in other pieces, to see whether they are actually fit and ready for the same level of let's say the regulatory level playing field when it comes to digital assets and digital financial services in general.
I'd like to add to that. I'm also what they call shadow rapporteur. It's a nice bureaucratic word for the digital euro. Now, it's not exactly blockchain, but it has to do with stablecoin. Why did they even come up with? Why did ECB even think of it? Mainly a reaction to Libra, if you remember something a few years ago with Facebook. That would be a token that would be a new currency, and with the oncoming of, I was thinking of the Greek word LFC, of the oncoming of Trump, that's the word in Greek, in English, with Trump's victory, stablecoins are going to become larger. So the importance for ECB is to have a sovereignty, and also what we need to do, and that needs to clear up for those who are, because yesterday, 2 days ago, we spent a huge amount of time talking about the technical details of the ECB. And for me, that's not our role. What should be the level of holding on the ECB, what the pay system should be, which company, no. Our role as legislators is to allow ECB to have that tool. Basically, we're asked, the ECB has to get approval from the parliament, that's part of our role, to float a digital currency. I don't think I want to get a 700-page report that I'm going to vote on whether it should be 500 euro holding for the new euro or 700. That's for the technical experts. But all we're going to vote on is to allow it to exist. We need that tool because the stable coin is already, the Circle's already setting up a stable coin in Europe, big one. Yeah. We know which one that is, and we don't know what will happen. So we need to have one extra tool in the bag of the ECB, so we have a European sovereignty base. It's a political issue. So just to clear up, that when, as you say, when people come with technical issues, my answer is we are going to vote on allowing that instrument. Let ECB figure out the details with the banks and the market. For us, it's one tool and a very important one, especially in the new world that's going to be coming. I think in 3 years we won't be able to predict, just like I can't predict in 2030. I was on the Envy committee for a little bit. What will be the new car? Hydrogen, electric? I don't know what the new currency will look like, and whether Trump is going to allow the dollar to be also a full-time stable coin, which will affect our situation here. So the ECB proposal is an important one.
Yeah, okay, this is fascinating, because I remember very vividly in May, I think the one-off Davos, which was in May of 22, when Madame Lagarde talked about this and really announced, within 5 years, we'll have a digital euro, we're going to do this, we're going to tackle, and of course, I was joking with Jean-Paul earlier that, it's kind of like a home renovation. It's of course going to be over budget and over time, but nevertheless, that activity has proceeded apace, and there's certainly quite a bit of activity happening within the ECB thinking about how would we create this system, what's it going to look like, et cetera. And I do think the question, I've always believed that we're going to see a world, and we already have this world, of course, where you have central bank digital currencies, you have stable coins, and you have pure, if you want to call them, cryptocurrencies, in addition to Bitcoin, of course. And certainly we've seen that come to pass, where all three of these things are in production, they do exist. But I'm curious, as a follow-up, really to each of you, as you care to respond, how you're thinking about this sort of requirement, really, that Madame Lagarde laid down back in 22, and the time frame around this, which is becoming more clear as time goes on when this might actually be in production, and how that affects your thinking around certainly the stablecoin provisions of MiCA, which themselves are a response to Libra because of the timing of when MiCA actually was passed, let alone now being implemented, and how that thinking needs to evolve. And I think you touched on this, Ondřej, but let's start with you, Nikos.
I was going to say that I think we have two models here. You say I was born in California, so I have a mixed background. And you also have an accent that sounds American anyway, so good company. I listen in the parliament who others have accents like me, so we have some company because it's very odd. This is the vagaries of the modern world where you live in many countries. So the US model is, even the Federal Reserve has said, let the stable coin flourish, and then we'll come and regulate it. And we're saying, let's regulate it before it comes. So that's sort of a different way. So we need to think about that a little bit. And so they're actually allowing the stable coins, the USDC and other ones, to be big players. And then they will come in. I'm not saying that'll work. The attitude is different. So I don't think the Federal Reserve is going to do a digital dollar, but it's going to exist in other forms.
What I would say regarding ECB is that I'm more concerned that the central bankers lose focus on their primary task, which is, price stability and controlling and keeping inflation very, very low. I had a exchange with Madame Lagarde at her appearance at Econ about a month ago, and I asked about the climate change agenda and how the bank is actually trying to include this kind of climate criteria in their forecasting, because it doesn't seem clear to me how economists can look down the line 6 months, 9 months from now and try to predict natural disasters and this kind of thing. And she was very evasive in her answer. So I don't see any place for ideology, especially what's behind the green agenda, in the considerations of central bankers. They need to be focused, I would say, on their core business and not promoting any ideological agenda, in my view. Regarding the digital euro, I will also be a shadow rapporteur, so I'm learning more about this. I know it wasn't really pushed from the banking side, so it's not really clear what the end purpose of it is. And I know the United States has a completely different view of this at the present time. So that's really an open book, and remains to be seen what will happen. Again, my concern as a consumer, as someone who's in the Eurozone, Croatia introduced the euro just a year and a half ago, is more on these traditional tasks of the central bank, keeping the money supply stable, keeping inflation under control, these kinds of things, and less about this like I said, the climate considerations, because again, I think we can get distracted and lose sight of what's really the essential role of ECB.
Ondřej, do you care to comment?
Yeah, I think we are in a. I think there we are in quite a difficult situation in Europe. And looking in the future, I think for the digital euro, and I'm not a shadow rapporteur, so I can.
Say what you like.
I have a more
More immunity.
and I also come from a country that doesn't use the euro at this point, so I can have a more objective view as an outsider. No, but I think in general, I think it's actually good that the ECB is working on a digital central bank currency, because this is a trend that we see across the globe, at least in terms of exploring what and how it should work. That's definitely a good case. But I think the way the work is actually done currently by the ECB raises a lot of concerns. First of all, we still haven't heard a convincing business case, convincing use case. There's a number of considerations that are actually in play that will inevitably limit the possibility of using digital euro compared to other currencies, or the electronic money as we use it right now. So this is something that I think ECB should really be working more and discuss also together with the industry, with business community, but also with citizens. And I think one of the biggest hurdles for digital euro to be part of our economy at this point is the infrastructure and costs. We don't know the costs. And all these reasons are actually very closely linked to the possible acceptance of digital euro. If we don't know exactly the costs of operations, then it's very likely, it's not very likely that the retailers, for instance, retail businesses will be able to work along the digital euro project acceptance. And the other one, at this point, I think we really are not convinced that people should have trust and believe that there's enough privacy and security linked to the digital euro. And ECB did a survey 2 years ago, and the European citizens were clear. One of the highest concern for them in terms of the CBDC is privacy and security. If you look at the acceptance of Bitcoin, for instance, people have a lot of trust in it and a lot of and believe also that the privacy is covered. I mean, at least those who invest in it. But it's not. We are not there. We are not anywhere near with the digital euro at this point, at least in the public debate. So I think this is something that we need to overcome. And with the stable coins, as I said, I mean, in MiCA, what we created is actually extremely difficult conditions for euro-denominated global stable coins to be issued. There is one currently fighting a huge problems in terms of balancing reserves and etc. So it's a nightmare. I mean, so there are conditions for industry to issue the euro-denominated stablecoins in Europe only. That can happen, but I think if we want to get more liquidity and then outreach on other markets, the MiCA is a problem there.
Yeah, and those caps are real.
And we mentioned that to other colleagues from the very beginning, but actually what made the final text in MiCA look like the way it was adopted was not only Libra, but the final negotiations happened during the time of US Terra Luna collapse.
Yeah, of course.
And other market events, and I can tell you, I was sitting around the table, and there was people coming from other political groups saying we need to push more, we need really to get the stablecoin part very hard in order to protect the investors and citizens. And it was very, very difficult to actually face this, and that's where we are. So I think when I mentioned that we should already now gather evidence on where the regulatory framework provides or delivers on our expectations, one of the key areas is the stablecoin. I mean, if we want to have a stablecoin ecosystem in Europe, or euro-denominated stablecoin that is on the same footing globally as US-denominated stablecoins, for instance, then we have to do something in MiCA, or work together, for instance, with our US counterparts, that we have at least relevant regimes on both sides. So that if you issue a global stablecoin, that you don't have to actually comply with two different regimes on both sides of the Atlantic, which is it's extremely expensive and it's extremely burdensome.
Yeah, I mean, mean, look, I think one thing that is easy to forget is that any piece of legislation passes in a context, right? And the context is really determinative of what actually happens and what is prioritized and what the focus is. And so the reason that there is, I would argue, an outsized focus and language around stablecoins is because, to your point about the timing of what was happening when that was passed. And so, of course, now we're years later and we look at it and we think, oh, that's an interesting frame, on certain topics. Similarly, you made the point earlier about DeFi, where DeFi was, where DeFi is, very different kinds of things have emerged in that particular subset of the ecosystem that people didn't necessarily, including I think in industry, foresee how that was going to develop and go. But I want to, we could do so much on that, but I want to touch a little on your last point, which is certainly at the, when I moved full-time to industry 7 years ago, the idea was we want harmonization of regulation. We want everything to be seamless and even as close to passportable as possible, from place to place. And I think with the changes in the US, which we're going to talk about that at the end of the day, so I don't want to preclude that now, but we'll have a chance to get into some details about what we're seeing emerge with this new administration and new Congress that's going to come in the end of January. But that being said, there, I think, is more of a competitive posture now because we are further along. And there is a desire, whether it's within the EU, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the UK, whether it's the US, to think that this technology clearly isn't going away. It clearly is going to underpin, not everyone understands, I think, the connections with AI or with other kinds of technologies. Nevertheless, those will become clear in short order, I believe. And because you think of this as foundational technology now, and its stickiness is apparent, and its market importance is apparent, and only going to continue to rise in importance and in market cap, frankly, there I do think is more of a competitive posture. So how are you thinking, without having to go into detail about what you imagine might happen in the United States, but how are you thinking about Europe and the EU in a competitive crouch, right, compared to some of these other places? And I will say, of course, there are a lot of recognition, we'll stipulate, there are a lot of other things that go into where someone chooses to build a business. There are, to the point you made, language, things, there are immigration questions, there's talent questions. But if we could kind of stipulate that all of that is going to remain sort of what it is, how are you seeing the EU's competitive posture versus other jurisdictions, and where are you seeing the biggest pressure come from? Anybody want to go first?
Go ahead. I think, I came recently, so yeah, clearly the Draghi report expressed many things that we've been thinking of. And that we're behind on competition doesn't mean dropping all the regulations on the environment, for example, but it means we have to speed up. It's not an easy thing to do. We've got 27 countries. How do you speed up competition? How do you move beyond some of the regulations that I'm very glad to hear that MiCA clearly needs some changes on the stablecoin thing. So my general attitude is we're going to be pressured more and more to move faster. It's a little bit scary to hear that word, but to move faster on competition. That's my general attitude. And in terms of regulation, we have to look what we're doing. I gave almost a funny speech in plenary. I tend to add too much humor in my discussions, which is just a habit. So I said our incentive when we're in Parliament is to pass laws, because at the end of the 5 years, what people look at is, and you even get a reward for how many laws, and you get sort of a top 5.
Yes.
What kind of incentive is that? So we have to think about the internal incentives on this thing. The idea that at the end, he's going to do more laws than me makes me feel a little bit odd. I mean, I'm against that, obviously. We want agile regulation, intelligent laws that get the consequences that we want, which means, however, that we come to Parliament from all walks of life, mayors, actors, dance, whatever, it could be journalists, and suddenly the next day we're passing laws. So we need to think about the internal incentives. How that'll help competition, we need to think about that.
Thoughts, Stephen?
Well, that's a big topic. I would say, again, an anecdote from the hearings with Commissioner-designate Dombrovskis. I had an exchange, and I told him that for me, deregulation is not a dirty word. He was trying to avoid using it, talking more about streamlining and so on. But the reality is, I think, when you see what Trump has announced about going, back to cheap energy and basically not being, opposed to fossil fuels and so on is an indicator where we're heading. And again, I'll mention the climate change agenda and the green agenda. We've seen recently what's happening with the auto industry in Germany. For me, coming from Croatia, the first intuition is that something is wrong if German car makers are in trouble. Something's wrong because we all know that it's such a reliable brand, and so we have to, I think, again rethink some of this because Europe could lag behind if it's not able to adapt and, frankly, be more pragmatic about things. Croatia is the newest member state. We joined in 2013. Is not a polluter. We have very little heavy industry. Our habits will not determine the fate of planet Earth. We're a small player. We have India and China, many of these giant companies who are not abiding by the same rules, and so that's the environment we live in. And Europe has to be aware of that. We talk a lot about competitiveness, but whether the incoming commission will actually be consistent on this, because there's so much. I asked Dombrovskis, is he willing to block potential new legislation that will impede Europe's competitiveness? And he would say, well, it's a collegial approach. We try to reach consensus, but the reality is, in my view, that we should not agree to remain hostage to any agenda, including the green agenda. So that's what I've been saying out loud. I think it's costing Europe jobs already, and in many countries, it's gone, in my view, and this is my own personal view, gone too far. So speaking as a Croatian MEP, this is not, for me, the priority is to make really Europe competitive, make Croatia competitive, keep people in high-paying jobs in the country. Our main problem is really losing our population. So everywhere in Europe you see this demographic crisis, and in smaller countries it's especially acute. Parts of Croatia are already empty, half empty, and so it's a very serious issue. And on the people's minds, at least my voters, is not so much about how to meet the climate requirements, but how to make Croatia a competitive, prosperous country. That's really what's on their mind.
I appreciate that context. Before we turn to Ondřej, I'll just flag that we will take a couple of questions from the audience. We have Amanda with a mic, so if you have a question, please do just put a hand up for her. But Ondřej, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mentioned it at the beginning. I think there may be a change of dynamics between the EU and US with the new US administration. And I think, to be honest, that we should not just sit and wait in Europe. We should try to engage with whoever will be in charge in the US on all the levels, from the highest to the expert level, whoever will be in charge of preparation of new rules. The sooner the better, because, as I mentioned, with the adoption of MiCA, specifically the crypto industry, was sort of attracted to Europe by longer stability and predictability of rules, which was exactly the case, the problem in the US, on the US side, with number of decisions that were not fully consistent, not clear, not very often not expected. So I think this is something that for the businesses made a credible alternative. I mean, the European approach. If the conditions change on the US side, and some of the key extreme action from the administration will be either removed or put in a much clearer framework, then I think the US can again be attractive. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned that we already now see that some of the provisions in MiCA, put specifically those who are trying to play on a global scene in difficult situation. So I think sitting down together as soon as possible, and we will. I'm pretty convinced that we need to sit down with Trump administration since 21st of this January. We have a lot of things that we need to talk before they really happen. And I'm not only speaking about tariffs, not only speaking about energy, not only speaking China and Iran. There's so many issues together.
Yeah.
And I think just sit and wait approach on the European side would be really, really bad. So we should go to Washington. We should have a really good negotiating package, all the options that we want to talk about with Trump administration to have on the table. And I think including the digital financial services and digital assets regimes.
Mm. Do we have any questions from the audience? Amanda, maybe we can. Yeah, we'll take a couple at once and then have everyone choose to respond. And I'm just going to flag that I know, Ondřej, you have to run to a flight in a little bit, so feel free to please do that when you need to. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kamal Shumba from CoinDesk. I have a question for Nikos. You mentioned that MiCA stablecoin rules need changing. Can you sort of expand?
That was Ondřej, actually.
Okay. So, Ondřej, could you expand, please, a bit more on that?
Yeah, we'll take a couple questions, and
We're gonna group them together so everyone can get in.
Thank you. Jack Schickler from Euronews. One of the kind of main policy actions of the new commission is set to be boosting capital markets as savings and investment union. Some people say, crypto could be part of that, one of the investment opportunities within it, or that the technology could in some way help financial markets work better. What do you think is the contribution of Web3 to helping Europeans to save and invest better?
Okay, we'll take maybe one more.
Andrew McKenzie, again, aspiring pound-backed stablecoin issuer. While we focus on our distribution and in bringing capital into our project, one of the key questions that we get, particularly from US counterparts, is that there's a consensus that there's been a massive underperformance in European stablecoins since their launch. Do you feel that MiCA stifles innovation? And if so, how do you remedy that and allow European stablecoins to reflect, the size of the euro within traditional financial markets?
Okay, we'll take one last, and then feel free. We'll start with Ondřej with you. Feel free to answer one or multitude as you see fit.
Hi, hello, Jean Corentin, I'm a reporter with MLEX. One question for Mr. Kovařík. You insisted a lot on the fact that MiCA is a good framework and that we have to fully implement it before reviewing. There has been calls or even rumors that there might be some delays or freeze on that. Would you support a temporary freeze of 6 months even of parts of MiCA? Thanks a lot.
On the last question, I'm not aware of any proposals to freeze or suspend at this point, but I think that's more a question for the Commission. They will be in charge of the implementation and the member states. But I believe, from what I heard from the practice, including the licensing process and everything else, it's basically up and running in most of the member states with a view of full implementation by the end of this year or by beginning of next year. And I think it's mainly the licensing process that is actually very urgent right now, because most of the future crypto asset service providers will need to get a license, and I think there's a lot of rush in the market actually to get this done. On the stablecoin, I mean, I mentioned that for instance, the way all the requirements for the issuers are set in MiCA are extremely limiting, especially for those who would like to operate globally and hit more markets, or even the stablecoins actually that would be issued before full application. Now the stablecoin part is applied, but those who actually issued the stablecoins before, now they have to make sure that they are fully compliant. It's not easy as well. But I think mainly the issue of reserves, the redemption, and there's a number of issues that are very, very strict. So this is something that I would look into, but just take it as my political view. I'm not saying this will happen. I think at this point I may be in minority, but the feedback I got from the industry, from practice right now, is that there is a number of serious hurdles that the potential issuers need to meet in order to be able to comply fully with MiCA regime as it stands. And I think, to be honest, I think it was also one of the ideas that possibly, for instance, the central banks had in mind to make sure that the stablecoins would not be easily issued and circulated on one market, but also with the view of CBDCs to be in place. But that's more my speculation. But I think, I mean, let's see. It's more my invitation also to industry. I mean, give us as much as evidence as you have. If you're trying to issue tokens, stablecoins in euro across the globe, like what it means, what kind of issues you met on the way, so that if we have a review, and we will have a review of MiCA, then we can sort of gather this evidence and put it on the table, the CMU, to be honest, I think it depends on the pool of liquidity and the amount of money that are invested in crypto tokens. But in general, I think where it already helped to boost the investor culture, it's actually the very easy way to approach it. I think Stefan mentioned this issue with kids being addicted to the phones. Anyway, I mean, if you're a university student, I always use this example. I mean, you're just sitting on your bus, on the way to campus. You can invest all the money you have in crypto, just using your phone. It's very easy. Mm-hmm. It's very easy. If you want to do the same thing and buy, I mean, today it's easy. You can also buy ETFs, etc. But if you want to buy a regulated fund, you would not be able to do it on your way to campus, on the bus, because you would have to meet someone, sign stuff in different countries, right? But I think just want to showcase that it's very easy now when you buy digital assets to actually enroll. Obviously, with all the KYC onboarding procedures, but it's usually quite easy, right? And I think this is something that if is used across the financial sector, so that investors can actually still have their rights and the level of protection guarantee, but at the same time we can use new technology to make our investments and also have a control over them. This is something that can definitely boost from the citizen side the investment culture in Europe. But I don't say this is the only thing that will solve the CMU issue. Definitely not. But that's the part of financial literacy and also awareness of citizens, and it gives us alternatives, right? Mm-hmm. which were not existing before. So also maybe a good point. But I think for the CMU or the Saving Investment Union to really happen, it would require more than just helping the crypto and digital assets innovation to happen. Thanks.
It's cultural too. Yeah. Nikos.
I was just to add to that. I think we need the CMU. We have fragmented markets. It's not going to be the only thing that'll help us. But however, I see the token with blockchain a way for basically bypassing the rules of banks so that small investors can collect money for an investment. It might be strong in the future, it's hard to know, but I can imagine, I'm thinking of Greece, where to get a loan, if you're not known, you have to give your grandmother, your grandfather, your house, the whole thing, just to get the collateral. You could do it with a token in the future. So that would improve the investment space. So with the blockchain, there's a sense of a guarantee. That'll take time, that culture, but it's in the books. So I think it'll be one more element. It won't solve the CMU, but
piece
it'll be
piece.
one more element.
Piece by piece. Stephen, any final thoughts?
Are we finishing up? I do want to just say one point that hasn't been said, and the future is obviously digital. It's already here, and that's the reality. I would say, though, that for my voters, my base in Croatia, preserving and protecting cash payments is very important. We want to allow people to choose, not in the future to have less freedom in how you do your everyday buying and selling, but to preserve and that traditional way of paying, and which is still a very big part of Croatian culture, at least. So that's something that I've said at some of the hearings, and because I've seen in certain countries already limits being placed on cash payments and so on, the amounts, and I think we don't want to go in that direction where that traditional way is banned. I think that's not a good sign. And so even at an event like this, talking about innovation and the digital future, I do want to say that cash payments, in my view, should be protected.
I think it's a fantastic point and a good place to end us, with the note and the context that in any event, we're going to have a variety of options available to consumers, to institutions, to businesses going forward. There will be, I think, increasing global variety around the world. And I do think that that posture of deciding where you're going to want to start your business, lend your business, live, et cetera, how we're going to interact with each other in perhaps a simultaneously more global and more isolated world is going to be fascinating to watch. So stay tuned. But please join me in thanking our members of Parliament for their time today. Thank you all so much.